Welcome to the Real Business of Wine focus on India. This is one that I've really wanted to do from the beginning because I've been following the Indian wine industry in every respect for rather a long time. I first went there in the 1980s, and I have to say I drank some of the worst wine I have ever drunk anywhere on God's earth that was then being produced in India. There wasn't a lot of wine produced in India at the time, and quite a lot of it that was being produced was fortified and was not what most people outside India thought of as being a drinkable product. Over the years since then, I've seen an explosion in India in all sorts of ways. One of our guests this evening, Rajeev Samant, is one of the people who's helped to lead that explosion with Sula Vineyards, which was really one of the very first modern internationally focused wineries, which brought in expertise from elsewhere, created a world class Sauvignon Blanc in particular, introduced screw caps to India and all sorts of things in various ways, and indeed wine tourism and distribution. And to declare an interest, Sula actually does yes, we do. Sorry, Polly, the answer is yes. And Rajiv's business, Sula, actually distributes my wine, Le Grand Noir, in India and has helped to make it a very successful brand there. Cecilia Oldne, again, I've known for a long time, Swedish initially, has worked as a sommelier and all sorts of things. We first met, I think, in London and then in South Africa. She might say a few words on that. But she also worked, it's a small world, the Indian industry. She also worked for Sula, but today, that's not the hat she's wearing. In the last few years, she's been working for a company called Amphora Portfolio, and they do wine investment, specifically looking at India in particular. And that is an interesting area because this is something that didn't used to happen in India. Next on my screen to the right of Rajeev, you may see them in a different order, is Sonal Holland, Master of Wine, India's first Master of Wine. Someone who I remember was switched on to wine, I think she said, by watching Jancis Robinson. She may say a few words about that. But Sonal is really part of the new wave of what's happening in India, where a whole new generation of wine drinkers, not all of them just in India, quite a few people are coming back from working overseas, working in the States, working in Europe, and bringing back some of the tastes they've discovered. But Sonal, with her video work particularly and her teaching, is really helping to introduce wine to a huge number of people. And then I haven't got a video, I haven't got an image of Subhash Arora. We need an A at the end of his name, it's an S at the moment, but Subhash Arora, who is the Indian Wine Academy, has been really one of the sources of information on India for many, many years. And not accompanying, but alongside him, I think we will have Reva Singh of Sommelier magazine. So we've got two commentators, journalists as well with us. And what we're going to try and do this evening is try and cover the whole gamut of India for the people who know a bit about it as a market and for the people who actually don't know anything at all. Because I think India is often put into a list alongside China, alongside Russia, alongside other what are called emerging markets. And I think it's not an easy one. So what I'd like to do is, actually, I'm going to start off with Sonal. Just give your overview of where you see India today, where it's come from and where it is today. And I slightly deliberately wanted to show how complicated things are with the little chart behind me, which does show the fact that you've got some states that are dry and all those numbers, so the crosses, and you've also got a number of numbers on that map of India, which shows that the drinking age varies from 18 to 25, with 23 in some places and 21. So it's not one country, is it, Sonal? So go ahead, describe the Indian wine picture, if you could, please. There's a challenge for you.
All my answers are going to be with rose-tinted glasses, okay? Because I'm very biased. I truly believe in the future of wine in India. And I've been a vehement crusader for the growth of wine in India. Yes, we have our fair share of challenges. We are a country from, I mean, people think of us as the land of prohibition, all the way at best to be highly regulated, which we are. We're a very challenging market to crack into. And anybody who's looking to get into this country and do business of wine in India is going to have to be very patient, have to persevere, because you're right, it's not like catering to one country where 29 states, each state has its own set of regulations on production, transportation, marketing, sales of wines, and all of this makes it very, very difficult. But I can't help but look at the brighter side of things also, which is, all said and done, wine is the fastest growing and the most rapidly growing beverage in the country. I see women taking to wine in a very big way, and that's a big thing because India is 50% women. And even as near as within the urban cities, up until recently, women have had to camouflage their drinks, what we commonly refer to as spike our drinks, have vodka along with Coca-Cola mixed in it, because we live in a joint family system. So women haven't traditionally been encouraged to openly consume alcohol. And I see a major shift today among women where they're sportingly, carrying a glass of wine and swirling their wine and having it. And, they have the blessings of their in-laws and the joint family systems, their husbands and so on. And at the other end, we have a whole set of millennials, and it's no secret that India is the youngest country in the world. And we have a whole set of millennials who drink everything, of course, not just wine, but wine assumes a definitive place in their drinking repertoire. And we are such a young country. So if I just look at women and millennial alone, even if nobody else ever takes to wine in a big way, these two demographics alone should be able to carry and thrust us forward in our vision for wines in the country. And of course, I could say a lot more, but I'm going to just stop at that, and wait for you to ask me or someone else a question. But to me, the future of wine in India is really bright. What we're going through right this moment in time, maybe a little more than a hiccup, but that's a different story. And of course, we'll talk about that more as we go along.
I'm going to, Rajeev, I love the fact that Sonal is coming in with these rose-tinted spectacles, which gives me the opportunity to not remind people, but tell everyone that India is the only country I know in the world which has prohibition in its constitution. It is item 47, as I recall, which says it's part of a general improve the health of the nation clause, but it actually does say to move towards prohibition. Now, Rajeev, you can talk about how much wine Sula is making, and you also make some spirits as well. But also you distribute wine, as I was saying earlier. How much of a challenge is the politics and also the states? Can you sell your wine everywhere? How much do taxes vary, for example, from region to region?
So it's a huge challenge. You're absolutely right that prohibition is enshrined in the Constitution. Wine and all alcoholic beverages also happens to be a state subject. So as you've got that chart behind you, shows that we have about 30 states. Each one of them has its own alcobev constitution, you could say. And so pretty much when we sell wine in India, it's like selling in an entire continent. For each one of those 30 states, we need a different label. And each one of those 30 states typically has a different language. So then we need to print the legend in the label in that language. 5 or 6 of the states are totally dry, no alcohol allowed. Our own state of Maharashtra, which has been so progressive in the matter of wine, also has prohibition enshrined in the state constitution. So right now, though Sonal's got her rose-tinted glasses on, me being in the thick of things, I have COVID-tinted glasses on, very unfortunately. And we are struggling. We're struggling with simple things like trying to get our state to agree to open up home delivery. So there's all these restrictions on going to liquor stores. And liquor stores, by the way, or wine shops in India is typically a 4 feet or 5 foot counter hole in the wall. And then you have to line up outside on the street and, you know, shout in your order, and it's chaotic. It's just everything that you expect of India. Somehow though, they managed to get through the chaos and get your drink to you. So obviously in the age of COVID, you can't do that. So they just opened all the stores for One day there were massive crowds outside. They started hitting people with batons in certain places. And then they decided to shut all the shops saying, oh, people are not ready for it, so let's close it. What did they expect? So we are right now arguing with the authorities and trying to persuade them to do this simple thing of allowing home delivery of alcohol. That's just one of the battles we fight on a daily basis. It's a miracle that we've reached as far as we have. Sula is a 1 million case producer today. And we never thought, when we started out, I never thought that we would get anywhere close to that. I thought, 10, 15,000 cases would have been a good place to reach, but we've reached 1 million. Having said that, we are still about 1 or 2% of total alcobev consumption in India. In some cities like Mumbai and Bangalore, that's now up to 5%. So that's exciting because it used to be about 1/3 of 1%. So we've already reached 5%, for instance, in Mumbai. But, each percentage point is a massive struggle. So on the one hand, you have massive opportunity. On the other, you have a daily massive challenge, a huge mountain to climb every single day.
You have a fascinating thing that I've always found fascinating, which is that until recently, you've had really a lot of pressure on wine in terms of the price people are prepared to pay for it and how you get distribution, and also the way in which, as you said, we don't have the kind of sophistication of wine shops and even wine in supermarkets you have elsewhere. However, the whiskey market in India is extraordinary. It's brilliant. People pay a lot of money for whiskey. They care about whiskey and so on. And there's an argument that the whiskey train is actually pulling wine in a way behind it quite successfully. But there is an area that's been successful within India from the early days, which is, of course, the on-trade, the on-premise, because wine was built in the on-trade, which gives me the opportunity to introduce Reva Singh, who has a magazine called Sommelier, which is not just for the on-premise, but it is actually, she has got a particular knowledge as well of the on-premise world. Reva, how you've heard, you arrived a minute or two late, but Sonal's got her rose-tinted glasses. Rajeev is in the thick of it with his COVID glasses. How do you see the world of Indian wine today from where you are?
Robert, when I started the magazine 15 years ago, I was really very optimistic because we were starting from a level of next to no wine, but we were now producing wine, we were importing more and more wine. And I thought we would have reached a stage where, it was a quantum leap. It should have been, but it hasn't been that much because of our taxes, because of all the things that Rajeev has spoken about. And I like to tell it as it is. We can't, people seem to think in those days that we're such a large country, millions of people, and a new market ready to be broken into. But that wasn't the case. And I don't see it. What I will say is that wine drinking is here to stay. The wine drinking culture has taken root in India, and every occasion, whether it's a women's kitty party or a society wedding, wine is always included. And there are people now who understand wine and who know what they're drinking. And it's not just a case of, I'll have a red wine or a white wine and that's the end of it. But it's minuscule compared to especially the whiskey segment. And what's less encouraging is that because of the taxes and because of all the regulations, which seem to get more complicated with time instead of getting simpler, importers are not keen to import really good wines.
Thank you. I'm going to move across to, again, looking at back to the rose-colored spectacles, or the optimistic side. I'm going to move across to Cecilia, because Cecilia is doing something which I didn't think necessarily anybody would be doing a few years ago, which is talking about investment quality wine and really fine wine. which really wasn't being talked about in India, certainly in my experience 10 years ago. And Cecilia, you've moved from the world of Rajiv's Sula wines and the imported wines that Sula brings in to talking about top Burgundies and Bordeaux. Talk us through a little bit of that and what you see in Mumbai, particularly where you live.
So I see, to start with, a very big change from when I came. I came to India in 2007, and coming from Sweden to India at that point, I remember one thing that really struck me was that the knowledge of wine wasn't there. So with Sula, we put a lot of efforts in the wine tastings and of course with the wine tourism at the vineyards. We had about 400,000 people last year. So over the years, I saw the increase in terms of knowledge, and I realized how important it is to educate. And with that, of course, now wine is more acceptable, and people know more about the product, they know about the Indian wines. With Sula, we also started importing wines, and we educated them about the fact that there's the Riesling from India is different from a Riesling from Germany, etc. And that has really helped me to come to the stage to where I am today. So during the time with Rajeev, I also then started with wine investments because it's a great investment commodity that people do not know. So going back from then having to start to educate people about wines for consumption, we then have to put a lot of efforts into investing time in educating people about wine also as an investment commodity. And that we do across the country. Mumbai has, for natural reasons, because I'm based there, been a market where I've been focusing a lot, but we've realized that when it comes to wine investments, when it comes to any kind of investment commodity, people are quite still exposed to various investments. So we've been focusing a lot also on other markets, say for Chennai and Chandigarh and Pune has been really successful for us to go to. So yeah, I happen to be in Mumbai, and we do a lot of activities in Mumbai, but it's growing across India, and that's encouraging. It's encouraging that I know that everything from Sula to the imported wines that are available also help increase the knowledge about wines, and that also makes it easier for me today to introduce wine as an investment.
Can I come back? There's two things that whenever we talk about India, and anybody talks about India, at some point somebody very early on says, yes, the taxation is so high. Of course, I'm in the UK. Our taxation is not nearly as high as it is in India, but by comparison with the rest of Europe, our tax is very high compared to anywhere in mainland Europe. And yet Britain has become quite a big wine consuming country. Despite that, Ireland has even higher taxes than we do, and some of the Nordics have high taxes. People in India do pay a lot of money for whiskey, as I said. So which is the cart and which is the horse? Do you have high taxes? Do people not drink wine because the taxes are high, or are taxes high because there isn't enough of a wine culture for people to complain about high taxes? And is that something that we're ever going to see changing? Because you do have a wine industry now, people like you, Rajeev, and a number of other up and comings, a lot of new wineries in the last 10 years. Do you have enough of a lobby for wine within India to actually change that situation? Rajeev, I'd be interested, because that's what you'd be doing, trying to do on a daily basis, I'd imagine. Hold on, we can't hear you. We can, yes, go ahead.
Unfortunately, we are nowhere near that stage. 1.3 billion people, and we're probably at a couple million, 2 million, maybe max wine drinkers, maybe even less than that. So that's just to put it in perspective. So we are talking about not even 2% of the 0.2% of the population. And so that's a challenge. We don't even come onto the radar for most policymakers. So they are very much focused on taxes on whiskey, as you very rightly say. India is the largest whiskey market in the world. For those of you who don't know that, I guess most people do know that. So the tax always is led by the tax on whiskey, then beer, which has come up pretty well in the last decade or so. And that's an interesting story, because India was not a big a beer consuming country, and beer today is pretty damn big. So it does show that things can change, though they do take their time. And wine is very much an afterthought. So it's rare that policymakers think about wine. The two exceptions, the main exceptions are Maharashtra state, where we are. Most of us who are on this call are speaking from Maharashtra state, where Sula is, where 80% of India's wine is produced. And then Karnataka, which is the home of Bangalore, Maharashtra, of course, being the home of Mumbai and Pune, and where the rest of the wine is produced. So these two states where the wine is actually produced, the grapes are grown, you have policies that basically support the farmer. And that's why we've managed to get even some amount of supportive policies for grape farmers. But where you don't have grapes being grown, you have extremely high taxes, and you do have the issue where you just don't have a lobby that's capable, and the taxes are high. So, you know, as Reva said, you can see that Reva is not in the best frame of mind about this, because the place that she lives, normally Delhi, you know, they put the tax up on imported wine up 6 times just overnight. In you know, from one day to the next, the label registration fees on imported wine, including on a bottle of your lovely Le Grand Noir, which we import, and we were doing so well in Delhi, suddenly from 10,000 rupees a label to 60,000 rupees a label overnight. And there's no lobby, and there's no one who can really fight against that. So what happens in Delhi is importers like us, so we're, apart from being a producer, also an importer, shrinking our portfolios down by at least 50%. Ultimately, the consumer suffers.
Thank you. Let's go back to Sonal, because I think we need some pink colored glasses again. Otherwise, we're going to depress ourselves.
I don't know anymore now. After listening to everyone, I don't know. I'm changing my glasses.
But
Mumbai is not bad. Mumbai is still 10,000, so it's not bad at all.
But I also think that one of the things that strikes me, and I'd like to throw this at you, is there is a societal change in the sense that I think that the older men and older women in India were the people who were holding wine back, if you like. Interestingly now, to me, the future of wine in India, as in many other places, particularly in developing markets, seems to me to be with younger women. And I've stood and poured wines at events in India where the most questioning, the most enthusiastic people coming up were very often women who are coming up and wanting to know, and often knowing a lot. And I presume these are people who are following some of the things you're doing in terms of education. Am I right in seeing it that way, Sonal?
No, you're absolutely right, because you know, Robert, that I've been doing some consumer research with Wine Intelligence, the UK-based Wine Intelligence. And our research report, which was a 96-page report, which purely talked about consumer behavior, their awareness and their attitudes towards wines, very clearly showed that enthusiasm for wine was majorly skewed towards younger demographics, younger women, younger, millennial. So we're talking about 18 to 34 years of age precisely. And of course, 18 is subjective because certain states only start allowing you to drink from the age of 21, as we know. But it's basically the younger demographics. And it's a very interesting point that Rajeev made about how beer has just shot up in popularity. Because when we did this research and we spoke to a lot of the young people, not just through the questionnaire or survey, but even on a one-to-one, like a qualitative, in-depth interviews, there seemed to be many similarities between why they were liking beers and why they were liking wine. And one of them, among many others, was that they liked the fact that beers come in different styles, different flavors. It's a diverse drink, and popularity of craft beers is really on the increase in India. I mean, that's driving its popularity in India. So if you think of the entire beverage universe, the only other drink that offers you that same level of diversity, experimentation, excitement is wine. Where wine is at a disadvantage as compared to beer is we tend to complicate it. It tends to be far more intimidating as a beverage. And so beer is much easier to access and enjoy and less intimidating in that sense. But otherwise, if we are able to position wine as a more accessible, enjoyable, don't over intellectualize it, then actually there's a huge potential for its uptake in India. And I truly believe that among some of the people who are taking or entering the beverage drinking universe per se. The other point is, I'm totally empathetic about everything that Rajeev said. I think when you talk about production or you talk about the imports, it's not an easy business to be in. I hear this all the time, and it's very disturbing actually. But I've been fortunate because as a professional, as a master of wine, I've been involved more on the other side of things, which is more education, where I've seen tremendous enthusiasm, tremendous curiosity and thirst for knowledge on the consumption side of things. And for the longest time, I felt, oh, maybe I'm not being a full-fledged entrepreneur by just being a peripheral consultant or an educator or something. And maybe I need to deep dive into the deep waters. And so I decided to become a full-fledged entrepreneur by becoming a retailer. But now when I turned into a retailer about a year ago, and we've started these chain of modern retail stores in wine and beers, touch wood by God's grace, and I'm not talking about the last 50 days, but overall, it's a great business to be in because people are suddenly, off trade today, 70% of wine consumed in our country. On trade is increasingly becoming less and less important. So we find many people walking into our modern stores, which offer a more experiential shopping, experience, and people walk in and they're happy to browse through, buy wines, try different styles of wines, engage in conversations with people at the floor level. So I'm witnessing, maybe because I'm on the consumption side of things, I have reasons to keep wearing these rose-tinted glasses because I'm witnessing all the things that are going right for us.
Can I say that given the fact that I've seen this industry grow over the years, I actually have much pinker glasses than I used to have, I have to say, but I'm still quite realistic in what I see. What to me, I'm going to actually go off at a slight tangent because if I don't, I'm going to forget it. One of the things that comes up particularly with China, with Thailand, with India, is this question of wine and food. And I hear this particularly from French people, which is either the people who say, we'll never sell wine in these countries because their food doesn't go with wine, which means, or they're not compatible, which means that they're looking at it very much through a French prism, the way I see it. Or, of course, I then get people who say, my wine is perfect with Indian food, as if the whole of India has one cuisine, or as if the whole of China has one cuisine. Reva, you travel, I think everyone on the panel travels a great deal, but I meet you all over the world. How do you address this question? If a producer outside India is trying to sell wine in India, what advice would you give them in terms of the food and wine question? I need to free your microphone.
The way I talk about it is that I think it's very wrong to believe that only a chilled beer goes well with Indian food. And Indian food doesn't comprise just curry. Indian food, Indian cuisine is so diverse. And it's not all fiery hot food. It's aromatic. It's spicy in the sense of being aromatic. And then on the other hand, you have wines. And there is such a wide range of wine. And you will always find a wine that will go reasonably well with your food. It's just that we don't have a wine drinking or an alcohol drinking culture with food. Unlike the Chinese, they still drink rice wine, and the Japanese too, but we never had a culture of combining wine with food. So it's taken a little while to catch on, but I think it is very much there. And there are people who enjoy their wines, who enjoy fine wine. In fact, I am now focusing on the fine wine world spectrum.
Now that again, so if I can pick up there, but that's an interesting point because Stephen Spurrier had a business in India a few years ago. And he was saying to me the thing he liked about India was the fact that India was different to China, where China started with a lot of, in recent times, a lot of focus on Petrus and Lafitte and so on. And he was saying, the great thing about India is that it's all starting at a more affordable level. And I disagreed with him. And I said that actually, I think if you start at the top, this is what we've seen in California, you build some aspiration into it, and you end up selling $10 and $20 wine because people can see the existence of $50 to $100 wine. India's been quite slow internally, and this, the ball's coming across to Rajeev here. It's taken a while for India to really get into producing its own super premium wines. China is now doing that. You are now doing it in India, but it's been a slow move, hasn't it? Rajeev.
So I would say that we are 10 to 15 years behind China at this point, at least. And, you know, so China, yes, has gone ahead with Pet Cruz Lafitte. We must remember that taxation in China is much lower than in India. I mean, they have now free trade agreements with most wine countries. They didn't before, but even then the tax was, you know, at 40%. In India, it's more like 300%. So how do you get somebody to drink Mouton Rothschild when you've got 300% tax on the bottle? You know, we're not talking about a huge number of very affluent consumers here. I have a comment on the whole drinking with food thing. I want to say one thing, that, you know, when you look at Europe, the whole thing about drinking with meals is much more a mainland European habit. If you actually look at Britain traditionally, probably you have the tradition that we now have in India, where, you know, you'd have a couple of drinks at the pub and then go home for your meal. I think, you know, I don't see so many images of Brits from, you know, from 100 years ago sitting down and drinking, having wine or drinks with their meals. So India has inherited exactly that same culture. So we actually, the whole thing about pairing wine with food, it's immaterial to a large extent, because the culture here, 95% of alcohol is drunk before your meal. So the whole thing of whether it pairs with your meal becomes irrelevant. Nobody has ever said that whiskey pairs with Indian food. Yes, you have this whole thing about lager. Yes, you know, ad nauseum, cold beer, cold kingfisher with your curry. I mean, that's so 40 years ago. I mean, let's remember that we have people drinking sophisticated, you know, whiskey drinkers who don't care one hoot whether that goes well with their curry or their, you know, masala dosa or whatever. So that's one thing that I'd like to put, that India is still very much a culture of stand-up drinking. It is not yet sit down. I don't know when sit down's ever going to happen. And the stand-up, at weddings, at celebrations, at people's homes, wine is going through the roof for sure in urban areas, and we don't have to worry so much about whether it pairs with food. I tend to believe you can always find, I mean, you've got such a very cuisine in India, you're always going to find a wine that pairs with whatever it is you're going to eat, as long as it's not too spicy.
Sorry, can I just, Cecilia, this thing about the tax interests me, because India, like China, but more than China, arguably, has got a huge diaspora. There's a large Indian community in the UK, but in almost any country we go to, there's a large Indian community. Historically, I don't recall seeing a great wine drink, and I think religion and culture may come into this as well. There wasn't necessarily a big history of wine consumption and top wine consumption in the Indian community, for example, in the UK, or necessarily in some parts of the US. And that to me is relevant in terms of the taxation question, because people of an Indian culture in the UK are paying British taxes in the UK. Now that to me is relevant to you, Cecilia, because your customers, your Indian customers, presumably, if they're buying fine wine, can drink their fine wine outside India as well as inside India. What do you see happening there?
Well, our clients do drink wine, well, most of them, which helps. But when we build portfolios on the wine that we store for our clients in the UK in a custom bonded warehouse, it's not for consumption. These wines would not, if they would come to India to be stored in India and imported, we pay taxes. They, you wouldn't make a rupee on them. So because of the high import tax as well in India, you have no choice but to store wines and have investment portfolios of wines outside of India. Because these are wines that you then eventually sell off and make money on them. It's not for consumption. in terms of people drinking wines and knowing more about wines, we have so many people living and traveling and studying and working outside of India that comes back to India. And you have so many of these people then, you know, storing or keeping wines or drinking their wines outside of India and potentially bringing 1 or 2 bottles in. But when it comes to consumption of these, you know, Chateau Latour, Lafite, or Sassicaia, the consumption in India is still, you know, minuscule.
Reva, one of the things, again, looking back over time, so I know that Polly's got a quick question, so I'll do this one quickly. When I first came to India, most wine consumption was in 4 or 5 key cities. And certainly there wasn't a lot going elsewhere. How much has that evolved?
Well, it has evolved quite an extent to the second tier, what we call the second tier cities, Pune, Chandigarh, Calcutta, of course, has a good wine drinking culture. But, you know, what I'd like to say is the interest in wine is very much there. They may not be, I'm disappointed that the consumption of wine hasn't grown to the extent that I would have expected and I hoped. But my magazines is very popular. People want to read about wine. They want to know about wine. And I'm not only talking about Indian wine. So there is that, you know, element that gives you hope. And if by some miracle, it was easier to bring in wine and the taxes were lower, or if the hotels and the restaurants, you know, passed on their duty-free advantages to the consumer, it would grow more rapidly. But the interest is there, the knowledge is there, and when they travel abroad, they usually bring in wines when they're traveling, or they are these high-end wines, particularly. They ask their friends to bring them wines, and I know a lot of people who have wine chillers in their homes. And as I said, the wine drinking culture is very much entrenched in India, but it's a niche.
Thank you. Just before I hand over to Polly, it's worth pointing out, if you didn't know, that one of the peculiarities of India is that restaurants and hotels are effectively duty-free compared to the retail world. Polly, you had a question from someone.
I do. I have a question that was emailed in prior to starting. If government opens up the Indian wine market to international wines by means of reduced taxes, will this kill the nascent Indian wine industry or make it more competitive, resulting in better quality wines?
I think
well, Rajeev, you're in both camps. You're
yeah.
both an importer and a producer. How do you answer that?
So, my producer, I got to say that my producer hat is probably the more prominent hat. And this is always a bit of a tricky question. You do have those people who say that, yes, if duties go down, then consumption will go up, and then the rising tide lifts all boats. At this point, from our point of view, it's difficult to compete against, especially the EU. I must say that every time this question comes up, I do point out to people that the EU with, €1 billion backing their wine industry versus India with €0 backing our wine industry in terms of central grants, we're at a distinct disadvantage. And my approach to this has always been slightly nuanced, that we will need some modicum of protection against cheap imports. However, at the higher end, the kinds of wines that Cecilia would like to see people invest in, and Reva talks about in her magazine, and that Sonal would like to be retailing more of, wines that in the rest of the world might be €25, €30, €50, there is a lot of logic to bringing duties down. So right now you have 150% customs duty, central customs duty, plus states duty. And that's whether you're importing a €2 wine or a €200 wine, the duty is still 150%. We would prefer to see something more nuanced than that, where the duty goes down as the price of the wine goes up, but with a floor duty that makes sure that we are not flooded with wines coming in at €1.50 and €2, of which there's an enormous wine lake. If that wine comes flooding in, supported by the EU Common Agriculture Program, €1 billion a year to grapes and wine, then Indian wine production will probably come to a screeching halt. So that's our position.
Holly.
So following on from that, something working in wine marketing that I hear across the panel is the education, which there's much debate about how we market wine. I would be very curious to hear insights into what best practices are moving wine in the market in India, given regulations.
I think wine societies and wine clubs that arrange wine dinners is one very definite way, and people love. Sometimes it's just for the love of food. I have the magazine has a wine club. I mean, I'm involved in two wine societies. One is the Wine Society Delhi, which is the oldest society. It was the first wine society that came into being. And then I have a smaller one, which is, for the more discerning wine drinker, which I call the Sommelier India Wine Circle. And I started by calling it the Sommelier India Women's Wine Circle, because very often it's the women who introduce wine into their households. And then as the men started wanting to join, we dropped the Women's Wine Circle. But the other evolution was from being the Sommelier India Wine Circle, it became the Sommelier India Wine Circle and Supper Club. And this is where wine and food comes in. Very often people come and they want to attend wine dinners or wine lunches because they want to eat out at a nice place where the wine is properly served and where it's matched more or less with what you're eating. So it's the wine culture in India is growing in many different directions and has many different avenues. And I don't think we need to be totally disappointed by it. And what Rajeev says is eminently acceptable. And I really do wish the government would reduce the taxes on the higher wines so that we get more of those, at least up to mid-level, and then a little bit higher. And there are people who would buy those wines and, serve them at their tables.
Sorry, Sonal.
If I may add a quick point to what Reva just said, and Polly also particularly because you touched upon best practices, I also feel a huge amount of opportunity lies in the digital platform. I think we are in a position to create a lot of education, spread a lot of awareness and understanding of wine through the digital medium. We're seeing great traction for video-based content, broadcasting, where we're continuously talking about, teaching about wines on various social media platforms. YouTube is, I mean, we have some of the largest consumers of YouTube content in the world. Facebook, we're the largest consumers of Facebook in the world. Instagram is going through the roof. TikTok was invented by the Chinese, but there are more Indian consumers of TikTok than there are Chinese today. So I think there's a lot of potential. And this started before even the lockdown, but we've been getting a lot of inquiries about online courses in wines and sakes and spirits and other beverages. And really, there is no product like this in India. So I think there's where I think some of our, if you're talking purely education and not just for the trade, but also for consumers, I think that's where a huge amount of opportunity lies for us. And this is something we can do better than anyone else in the world because we can access technology at 1/10 the price of what you can in the UK or Europe or anywhere else in the world.
So that raises...
May I interject here?
Yeah.
But the problem is, it would be so much easier and so much better if along with the education, you were also able to drink the wine. And if they allowed us to, sell wine online, especially at a time like this where there's a lockdown, so that I could take out a bottle of wine and talk about it, and my audience, my readers, or whoever joins uh, the the Zoom chat would have the same wine to drink. It would be a much more meaningful experience. Apart from that, it would be so much easier. And this is where the Wine Society of India that you spoke about, where Stephen was also a founder member, they were doing this, but it wasn't entirely legal. So it sort of
that's
faded away. Yeah.
So what I'm curious about is that we have this balance between education and entertainment, or in the case of marketing, discussing kind of old school wine marketing versus lifestyle marketing, which is prevalent in beer and spirits. What I'm curious to know is if the social responsibility or the issues of prohibition, as it were, prevent Indian wine marketing from adopting what we would consider something as lifestyle marketing, where it is about the delight and the joy in the product, moving away from education and into entertainment or enjoyment.
So I've got a couple thoughts on that. It's very tough. We have a whole bunch of laws that prevent us from talking about wine online, prevent us from, of course, selling wine online, marketing wine, anything where you say, try this wine in the public domain is illegal. You can't do it. We have managed to overcome that by promoting wine tourism. That's one of the topics that Sonal and Reva didn't touch on. Cecilia had alluded to it, that Sula did get 400,000 visitors last year, which, I always tell Robert, I think that makes us the most visited vineyard in the world, but I'm not sure. I don't know how to figure that out. And that, it's so funny that in that way, our government is very liberal. So we're one of the few places in the world where you can come to the winery, drink a glass of wine and eat and listen to some music. In the US, when you go to Napa, you're not allowed to have you can't get a bite in the winery tasting room. You can only drink a glass. You can't. So in some ways we've gone beyond that. And that's one way that we found was where we could really blast this whole thing, bring people in from all over the country. We throw a massive music festival. So we're trying to get wine to be associated with fun, with light, fun, with music, with food. You can get some Indian street food and drink the wines with it. And that's been something that's been tremendously successful as well. But online, we struggle. We have lawyers having to check everything. And in fact, sometimes it's not necessarily worth it. Though Sonal has been doing some very cool stuff recently, I must say.
Cecilia, you're part of the sort of, if I can say, the social world, before lockdown, the social world of Mumbai. Am I right in thinking that is one of the ways in which wine is breaking through? So I was talking about education and so on, but there are a lot of events, social events and so on, where wine is now very much to the fore in a way that it wasn't. But I remember, I think you and I went to the one wine bar in Mumbai a few years ago. I don't know how many wine bars there are now. It's that those sort of things are just really breaking through now, aren't they?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I remember coming to India again 12 years ago, and first and foremost, you very rarely saw, as also Sonal mentioned, a woman drinking in a bar. There was maybe one white or one red on the wine list, and now you have so much more choice. It's been so much a journey to see it becoming so much more acceptable, and that's also in circles like Bollywood, cricketers. They now also more and more, I would say, drink wine. It's more fashionable, it's more sophisticated. So when you go to all these parties that I'm happy to attend myself fairly often, so many people drink wine because it's associated with being healthy, with being sophisticated, and knowing better than drinking hard liquor that is not as potentially healthy or interesting as other products. So I think that has really helped as well in terms of increasing the knowledge, in terms of increasing the image of wine that all these restaurants have so much offer, and then these Bollywoods and cricketers and celebrities also now drink wine. It really helps in these social circuits.
I'm very conscious that we've got sort of 10 minutes to go for the end. I would like, I mean, we get a huge number of international people watching the videos particularly. And the question really, as a producer, as we head into the post-COVID times, we're going to hit some very hard financial times. Everything you're saying is that India is not an easy place to sell wine. On the other hand, the world is going to be full of places that aren't easy to sell wine. And over time, as you're all saying, the Indian market will grow. What sort of words of encouragement and advice would you give to producers outside India? Would you be saying, look, just leave it for a few years, come back? Or would you say, come and put a small toe in the water? Reva, you've been watching the market for many years. How would you talk to a producer anywhere in the world who isn't currently looking at the Indian market? What would you say to them?
What I would say is that they shouldn't shut their minds to the possibility of a wine drinking market in India. And Indians, and I've heard this from wine producers who were exporting to India tell me that they like this market because it's a more discerning market. They like value for money compared to China. We don't drink labels necessarily. We want to know what we're drinking, and if we get a value for money, we don't mind paying a certain amount for it. But the other thing I want to bring in is that this period of lockdown and the fact that the government opened up the liquor shops and then shut them down promptly the very next day indicates that there may be an opening there. And Rajeev, maybe you could use that as a lobby, and all of us would help, because you must have heard, Punjab the states were very keen to allow liquor to be sold, and Punjab has allowed home delivery for liquor, alcohol, which will include wine, and I believe Chhattisgarh is developing an app. Now, in what direction that app is going to be developed, and how maybe a day will come when they will allow us to sell wine online.
So I would also add a few words here that at the end of the day, there has been double-digit growth annually in wine consumption over the last 2 decades. If you average it all out, we are growing at double digits a year. But it's still tiny when you look at the population of 1.3 billion. So when you're a producer in Europe looking at India, it's this giant, and you say, wow, China 1.3, India 1.3. India's got to grow at 50% a year to get to even 10% of China's size. That's not happening. So we've been in about a 10 to 15% growth rate for the last 20 years, and there's no breakout coming anytime soon. So what that means is that there's a small number of producers who will be able to come in here, be successful. There's also a small number of importers. In China, there's thousands of wine importers. In India, there's probably 10 or 15 wine importers that you can really deal with, where you'll get your money back for your goods and all of that. So it's pretty tiny because the government puts so many rules in the way. So it's a bit of a tough slog, but at the same time, you've got double-digit growth, which is going to continue in the long run. So
Sonal, you're going to take a positive view.
Yeah. In adding on to everything that everyone else has said, I think for a producer, he can't look at India market as a short-term solution. He certainly can't say, oh my God, now US was carrying me forward and now US is suddenly slowing down and China's let me down. So let me quickly turn to India and look to reap some quick, benefits. It's not going to work. I think anybody who comes into India has to survive the slow burn and has to be in it for the long run, because the point is that he's going to have to choose the right partner among these few dozen of people, and they will choose you rather. You won't choose them, because if you went to Rajeev and you said to Rajeev, import my wines, it's Rajeev calling the shots and not you. You know what I mean? So with a handful of importers, they decide which are the wines that they'll go after, and they'll typically go after brands that are easy to sell, the low-hanging fruits. So it is tough to first even get representation in our country, but once you've got it, there will be no promise of numbers, no promise of revenues. You should be prepared to do a significant amount of investment by way of marketing, making visits, meeting people, hosting the dinners, doing what it takes. But I'm still of the belief, you know, again, putting my glasses on, I'm still of the belief, if you're prepared to do all of this, then in the long run, you will end up with a market that's discerning, that appreciates your wine for what it is, and not just chasing it just for the brand that it is. And I think there's some good business to be had. I think, Robert, you should also add in terms of what success you've seen.
Yeah,
with your
Robert
personal
should
brand
add.
in India.
I was going to wait till last. I'm going to let.
Okay,
Cecilia.
sorry.
I
But
thought
I think but if I can add, I mean, I'm sure you'll have something to say, but as a consumer and as somebody who's been on the consulting side of the business, I've seen your brand, Le Grand Noir, see great traction, and obviously full marks to Rajeev and Sula Selections and team, and you, Robert, for making those wines that tick all the boxes, you know, because India wanted a French wine, but not necessarily the most expensive, and you gave the market what it needed, and so it's been a good success story, I would say. So there is some success to be had.
So let's hear a few words from Robert. Yes. How do you?
Well, I will say, I'm going to bring Cecilia in a second.
Be honest, Robert.
No, I've been, as I said, I've watched this market for a long time. My son turned 15 a couple of weeks ago, and I said a long time ago that I thought my son would probably be married and have children before I ever made any money out of wine in India. And that's not true. In fact, thanks to Sula and Rajeev, we actually are selling wine in India. It's not by any means one of our biggest markets. But it means that I've actually stood there. And I think that having been a wine critic and a wine writer, it's only when you stand behind a table or in front of a table pouring wine and hearing what people say in a market that you really understand what's going on. You've really got to really get a feeling. And I do honestly, and I'm actually, as I said earlier, I'm more on the optimistic side of the line, than I was before, but even almost year by year, I'm seeing these new generations coming through. I just do think that we are going to have to maybe discover new forms of marketing, as Polly was alluding to, within the laws that exist. I'm fascinated, for example, that our importer in Russia, who is very, very successful with us, with our wines in Russia, wine magazines are illegal, but one of the distributors has a catalog that is a magazine effectively. I think there are going to be some clever things going on. And I think what you're doing, Sonal, if I can return the compliment, I think some of the things you're doing online in terms of on video and so on is very much taking us in that direction. And Rajeev's Sula Festival, it's a great music festival that happens to be run by a winery. And there's spirits and there's beers and there's all sorts of things. So I think that there is a lot going on, and it's accelerated. It's accelerated hugely. But I'm going to bring this back to Cecilia, because you see all of it.
You know, so thinking from an importer or thinking from a producer's point of view, I mean, if I were looking at investing time and money in India, would I say yes? I mean, I personally, I think it's an example of someone that even invested my personal time and money into this country. And I think if you're persistent and if you have the will, you probably, you know, obviously would need a little bit of funds as well to be able to achieve. And if you have the right partner, I mean, I was fortunate to have a partner as Rajeev for 10 years. The sky's the limit. I think India is definitely here to stay as a wine producing country and as a wine consuming country. I'm still here, and I'm holding the India flag. So anyone looking into it, I copy all the things also that Sonal says. You know, keep these things in mind, that India is the place.
Cheers, Cecilia.
I think that basically
everyone's wearing rose tinted glasses now. Cheers to that.
In Hindi, you know, to say cheers in Hindi, we say Sula.
That's a great piece of marketing.
Subhash should say Jai Ho.
Yeah, I was just going to say, thank God Subhash is not here, right, to refute that.
So can I say thank you to you all. Good luck to everybody. And India, anybody who's not watching India at all, I think is missing a trick. But anyone who thinks that it's the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow is deluding themselves. But I think it's definitely part of the world. I look forward to seeing you all in the flesh somewhere soon, but take care, and thank you all to the participants.